It was a quiet afternoon in the city, and the sun was just starting to dip behind the tall buildings. The streets were filled with the usual hum of cars passing by, the sound of people talking and the occasional honking horn. Among the crowd, one figure moved slowly, his cane tapping the sidewalk with a steady rhythm. Mr. Thomas was no stranger to this neighborhood. He had lived here for years, in the same apartment building at the corner, and he always took his walk at the same time every day. People knew him as the older man who took his time with his cane in hand, moving steadily down the street. He was a quiet man, not one to stir up trouble or seek attention, but there was something about him that others respected. As he made his way down the street, a group of young men stood on the corner, leaning against a battered old car. They were laughing loudly, their voices echoing in the air. The group wasn't the type to keep to themselves. They liked to cause a scene, to make their presence known. Mr. Thomas, as always, paid them no mind. He simply continued on his path, his eyes focused ahead. But the group didn't let him pass so easily. One of them, a tall young man with a bright yellow cap turned backward, noticed Mr. Thomas walking by. He nudged the others, and they all turned to look at the elderly man. The young man smirked, pushing off from the car. He sauntered over to Mr. Thomas, blocking his path. "Hey there, old man," the young man called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "What's the rush? You got somewhere to be, or you just trying to get lost in your own thoughts?" Mr. Thomas didn't stop walking. He knew the game. He had seen it all before. Young people, full of energy and attitude, trying to make themselves feel important by picking on those they thought couldn't fight back. He had learned long ago not to engage in their foolishness. The young man stepped in front of him again. "You deaf or something? I'm talking to you," he said, this time a little louder. The group of friends behind him chuckled, clearly enjoying the show. Mr. Thomas stopped. He didn't want trouble, but he also didn't want to be disrespected. He looked at the young man, his old eyes calm and steady. "I'm just out for a walk," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of years and experience. "No need to make a fuss." The young man laughed, clearly not taking the words seriously. "Out for a walk, huh? You're just an old man who can't even walk straight. You got no business here. Why don't you head back home before we make you?" The word stung, but Mr. Thomas didn't flinch. He had heard worse in his life, and the things people said now didn't touch him the way they used to, but the disrespect hung in the air, thick and heavy. Another young man, shorter and with a leather jacket, joined in, his voice filled with irritation. "Yeah, leave the old man alone. He's probably just going to get lost anyway." The group was growing bolder now, their laughter louder. They were feeding off each other's energy, growing more emboldened by the moment. But still, Mr. Thomas stood quietly, not moving, his eyes never leaving the young man in front of him. "Come on, man. Just let us have some fun," the first young man said, stepping closer. His tone was taunting, but there was a hint of challenge in it. "You're not even worth the trouble, but we gotta see if you're as tough as your cane makes you look." The mocking words hit harder than they realized. Mr. Thomas had seen his share of battles, both on the streets and far beyond. But in the end, he had learned that true strength didn't need to be proven to others. It was something that lived inside, something that came from the quietest of moments. He sighed, the weight of the years pressing on him more heavily now. The years had not been kind to his body, but his mind had been shaped in the fires of experience. He had faced things far worse than a handful of young men with too much time on their hands. As the first man reached out, shoving Mr. Thomas's shoulder with more force than necessary, something changed. The young man seemed to think Mr. Thomas would stumble, maybe even fall. But instead, Mr. Thomas stood firm, steady as ever, not even slightly moved by the push. The young man's smirk faltered. "What's the matter, old man? You think you're still tough?" Without a word, Mr. Thomas straightened his back, his eyes narrowing slightly. There was no malice in his expression, only calm resolve. He had been through too much to let this kind of nonsense bother him. He placed a hand on his cane, using it to steady himself as he leaned in just slightly toward the young man. "You don't know me," he said softly, his voice low but carrying a weight that no one could ignore. The young man blinked, confused by the calmness in Mr. Thomas's voice. He had expected anger or fear or some kind of reaction, but instead he was met with stillness and something else, a quiet strength that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside. The other young men had stopped laughing. The tension in the air had shifted. They could feel it now, something unfamiliar. They had underestimated this old man, not realizing who they were dealing with. The tall young man took a step back, his bravado slipping away. "Whatever, man. You're not worth it." He motioned for his friends to move along, but they lingered for a moment, unsure of how to proceed. Mr. Thomas didn't watch them leave. He simply turned, lifting his cane to steady himself as he resumed his walk down the street. The moment had passed, and the world continued to turn, but the young men were left standing in the street, their earlier confidence now gone. They hadn't just been confronted by an old man. They had been reminded of something they hadn't thought about in a long time. Respect. Dignity. The kind of strength that didn't need to be shouted, but could be felt in the silence. And for a brief moment, as Mr. Thomas disappeared around the corner, they realized they had picked the wrong person to mess with. The next day, Mr. Thomas returned to his usual walk. The sun was shining brightly and there was a warm breeze in the air. He moved slowly down the same street, the familiar sound of his cane tapping on the sidewalk accompanying him as always. He wasn't in a hurry. He never was. These walks were a ritual for him, a time to clear his mind and enjoy the peace of the day. He hadn't forgotten the encounter with the group of young men from yesterday. It had been nothing but a brief moment, a small chapter in his long life. He wasn't one to hold grudges or let things get to him. The past was the past, and he knew better than to dwell on things he couldn't change. Still, as he walked, a small part of him couldn't shake the feeling that something had been left unresolved. As he passed the same corner where the group had gathered the day before, he saw them again. They were leaning against the same old car, laughing and joking, just like they had the day before. But this time something was different. They saw him coming from a distance, and rather than ignoring him, they straightened up, their eyes locking onto him as he approached. Mr. Thomas knew they had seen him. He could feel their gaze on him, heavy and expectant. The young men looked at him differently now, but it wasn't out of respect. No, it was something else. There was an edge to their behavior, a kind of nervous energy that wasn't there before. The tall young man with the yellow cap was the first to step forward, blocking Mr. Thomas's path again. He stood tall, trying to look imposing, but his posture was tense, like he wasn't quite sure what to do. The other young men watched closely, curious. "Hey, old man," the tall young man said, his voice a little softer than it had been yesterday. We didn't mean no harm yesterday. Just messing around, you know." Mr. Thomas didn't stop walking. He kept his gaze forward, his pace steady. He could hear the nervousness in the young man's voice, but he wasn't going to make a scene. He wasn't interested in a conversation that was forced or apologetic. He simply said, "It's all right. Just make sure you remember who you're talking to next time." The young man blinked, surprised by the calmness in Mr. Thomas's voice. He wasn't sure how to respond. Yesterday, he had expected the old man to react with anger or fear, but instead he had been met with nothing but quiet strength. It was disorienting. "We didn't know. You know who you were," the young man stammered. "We didn't mean to disrespect you or nothing." Mr. Thomas stopped, his cane tapping against the ground with a soft, rhythmic sound. He looked the young man in the eye for a moment, his face unreadable. "Respect isn't something you earn by apologizing when you get caught," he said, his voice calm but firm. "It's something you give to others no matter who they are or where they come from." The young man was taken aback by the words. He had expected an argument, a fight, something to prove who was in charge. But instead he was met with wisdom, something he hadn't expected from an old man with a cane. The other young men were quiet now, watching the exchange in silence. The air felt different today, heavier somehow. Mr. Thomas's presence was still commanding, but now the tension was different. It wasn't the defiance of yesterday, but the quiet respect that seemed to settle between them. Mr. Thomas didn't say another word. He turned to continue his walk, his cane tapping against the pavement as he moved forward. The young man with the yellow cap stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. But before he could speak again, one of the other young men, the one in the leather jacket, spoke up. "Let him go, man," he said quietly. "He's right. We shouldn't have messed with him, just let it go." The tall young man with the yellow cap looked around at the others. They were all staring at him, their faces serious. The playful energy from yesterday had disappeared, replaced by something quieter, more reflective. He took a deep breath, the weight of the situation finally hitting him. "Yeah, you're right," he muttered, stepping aside to let Mr. Thomas pass. As Mr. Thomas continued down the street, the group of young men remained where they stood, each of them lost in their own thoughts. They had been so quick to judge him the day before, to make fun of him, not knowing anything about who he was or what he had been through. They hadn't realized that there was much more to Mr. Thomas than his old age or the cane he carried. They hadn't realized that he was someone who had fought for this country, someone who had faced dangers that they couldn't even imagine. For a moment, the street seemed quieter than it had been before. The group of young men lingered on the corner, unsure of what to say or do next. They felt as though they had been given a lesson, though they didn't know exactly what it was. All they knew was that they had been wrong about Mr. Thomas, and the weight of that realization was heavy on their shoulders. The tall young man in the yellow cap turned to the others. "You think he'll be back tomorrow?" he asked, his voice quieter now, a far cry from the arrogance of the day before. "I don't know," the one in the leather jacket replied, "but we'd better be more careful next time." "Yeah," the tall young man said softly, his voice filled with a new sense of understanding. "We'll be more careful." The group didn't say much more after that. They simply stood there watching Mr. Thomas disappear around the corner, his slow, steady walk carrying him further out of sight. And for the first time, the young men didn't feel like laughing or making jokes. Instead, they felt something else, something like respect. It wasn't loud or obvious, but it was there, and it was enough. Mr. Thomas, meanwhile, had no idea what kind of impact his words had on the young men. He didn't walk away thinking that he had changed anyone's life or taught them a lesson. He didn't care about that. What mattered to him was the quiet satisfaction of knowing that he had stayed true to himself, that he had shown them that strength wasn't something that had to be proven with fists or anger. It was something that came from within. And as he made his way down the street, the sound of his cane tapping against the ground, he felt at peace. It had been a long time since he had let anything bother him, and today wasn't going to be any different. Tomorrow, he would walk again, and the world would keep turning. The days went by, and for the most part, Mr. Thomas resumed his regular routine. His walks continued just as they always had, his cane tapping steadily against the sidewalk, his eyes focused ahead. The world around him had a way of changing, but he remained the same. He wasn't one to seek attention or make a big deal out of things. He had lived through too much for that. His past, filled with both sorrow and pride, had shaped him into the quiet man he was today. The young men from the other day were no longer on his mind, though the thought of them lingered in the back of his mind like a faint echo. One morning, as Mr. Thomas set out on his walk, he saw them again. The same group of young men stood near the corner, leaning against their usual car. But this time there was something different about them. They weren't laughing and joking like they had before. They seemed quieter, more subdued. As Mr. Thomas approached one of them, the young man in the yellow cap spotted him first. The others followed his gaze, and their eyes flicked between each other, unsure of what to do. Mr. Thomas didn't change his pace. He wasn't bothered by their presence, not anymore. But he could feel the shift in the air. They weren't here to harass him this time. He could tell. As he got closer, the tall young man in the yellow cap stepped forward again. His usual bravado was gone, replaced by something more uncertain. He cleared his throat as though preparing for something. "Mr. Thomas," he said, his voice more respectful than it had been before. We wanted to apologize for the other day. We were wrong." Mr. Thomas paused for a moment, looking at him carefully. He didn't need to say anything. His silence spoke volumes. The young man continued, trying to find the right words. "We didn't know who you were, we thought you were just some old man, you know. But after what you said, after everything that happened, I realized we were the ones in the wrong." There was a sincerity in his voice now, something Mr. Thomas hadn't heard the day before. It was clear that the young man wasn't just apologizing to make himself feel better. There was genuine regret there. The other young men stood off to the side, watching the exchange. They were quiet, not interrupting, but each of them seemed to be processing the moment in their own way. Some of them looked at the ground as though ashamed of their actions. Others seemed to be waiting for something more to happen. Mr. Thomas didn't rush to respond. He simply nodded slowly, his gaze steady on the young man in front of him. "Apologies good," he said finally, his voice calm. "But respect is earned. It's something you show, not just say." The young man nodded, taking in Mr. Thomas's words. He looked around at his friends as though to share the weight of the lesson. "You're right," he said quietly, "and we didn't show you respect. We didn't think. We weren't thinking." The apology hung in the air for a moment, and for the first time Mr. Thomas felt the sincerity in the young man's words. There had been no mockery this time, no game. The apology was real. The silence stretched on for a few seconds, but Mr. Thomas didn't feel the need to fill it with words. He wasn't looking for an apology. He wasn't interested in forcing anyone to admit they were wrong. He had seen enough in his life to understand that people changed in their own time, and that some lessons couldn't be rushed. And so he simply said, "Just remember this moment, all of you. It's not just about today. It's about how you treat people every day." The group stood still for a moment, absorbing the quiet weight of Mr. Thomas's words. They weren't used to this. They weren't used to someone speaking to them like this. Someone who wasn't angry, who didn't shout or demand their respect. Mr. Thomas wasn't giving them a lecture. He was simply offering them a truth. One that wasn't easy to swallow, but one that was important. "Thanks," the young man in the yellow cap said quietly, looking at Mr. Thomas with a new kind of respect in his eyes. "I won't forget what you said." Mr. Thomas nodded once and started to walk again, his cane tapping against the pavement with each step. He didn't expect anything more from them. He didn't need to hear their thanks or see their changes. He had done his part. Now it was up to them to figure out what kind of people they wanted to be. The young man in the yellow cap stood still for a moment, watching Mr. Thomas walk away. The group of friends didn't move immediately, as though they were all processing what had just happened. It wasn't every day that someone gave you a lesson in respect without asking for anything in return, but somehow that made it all the more powerful. As Mr. Thomas disappeared around the corner, the young man turned to his friends. "We need to do better," he said simply. The others nodded, each of them reflecting on the conversation in their own way. Some of them felt embarrassed by how they had treated Mr. Thomas, while others felt a strange sense of responsibility now, as though they had been given an opportunity to grow, to change, to be better. The days that followed were quieter for the group. They still hung out together, but something had shifted between them. They didn't laugh as loudly anymore. They didn't joke about others the way they used to. They started to think about the people around them, about the way their actions affected others. As for Mr. Thomas, he continued his walks, the steady rhythm of his cane tapping on the sidewalk like it always had. He didn't think much about the young men. He had lived long enough to know that people changed at their own pace. Some lessons took time to sink in, some didn't, but in the end it wasn't his job to fix anyone. It was his job to be true to himself. One morning, a few days later, Mr. Thomas saw the group again. They were standing on the same corner, but this time they didn't look the same. They weren't standing around joking. They weren't leaning against the car, laughing at passers-by. Instead, they were standing straight, looking thoughtful. As Mr. Thomas approached, they didn't move to block his path. Instead, they gave him space, stepping aside without a word, as though acknowledging the change between them. Mr. Thomas smiled faintly, but he didn't stop. He didn't need to. They had learned what they needed to learn, and that was enough. Days passed, and the streets seemed a little quieter, a little more peaceful than before. Mr. Thomas's daily walks remained a steady part of his routine. He didn't expect things to change overnight, but there was something different in the air now. The young men he had crossed paths with, the ones who had first mocked him, were still around. But they were different, and Mr. Thomas could feel it. One morning, as he walked down his usual path, he noticed them again. They weren't gathered around the car this time. Instead, they were standing near the corner, a little off to the side, talking quietly among themselves. When they saw Mr. Thomas approaching, they didn't jump up or move to block his way as they had before. This time they stood still, almost waiting. As he got closer, the young man in the yellow cap, the one who had spoken to him the first time, stepped forward. He looked a little hesitant, but there was no trace of the arrogance that had been there before. He seemed different now, calmer, more thoughtful. "Mr. Thomas," he said, his voice a little quieter than before, "we wanted to thank you again. We've been talking, and we just wanted you to know that what you said really got to us. It's been on our minds for a while now. Mr. Thomas slowed his pace, looking at the young man. He didn't say anything right away. He just nodded, waiting for the young man to continue. The young man glanced back at his friends, then looked back at Mr. Thomas. "We've been thinking about respect, you know? What you said about how it's not just something you say, it's something you show. It stuck with us." Mr. Thomas didn't respond right away. He could see the sincerity in the young man's eyes, and that was enough. There was no need for more words. The lesson had already been taught, and now it was up to them to carry it forward. "We've been making changes," the young man continued, his voice more serious now. "We're trying to be better, you know? To treat people better. Not just you, but everybody. It's hard to change sometimes, you know?" Mr. Thomas smiled gently, a small, quiet smile that reached his eyes. "Change isn't easy," he said simply. "But it starts with one step. And then another. Don't expect it to be fast, but if you keep going, you'll get there." The young man nodded, looking grateful for the encouragement. "We're trying. We just wanted you to know we're not who we were before. We've been thinking a lot about what you said." Mr. Thomas didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. The young man's words spoke volumes, and Mr. Thomas knew that some lessons took time to sink in. He had taught them what he could, and now it was up to them to take the next steps on their own. The young man stepped aside, and Mr. Thomas continued his walk, his cane tapping steadily against the sidewalk. As he passed the group, he could feel their eyes on him. But there was no hostility now, no mockery, just a quiet understanding. For the first time in a long while, Mr. Thomas felt like he had made a real difference. He wasn't looking for thanks or recognition, but in that moment he could sense that the young men had learned something important. They had learned the value of respect, the importance of treating others with dignity, regardless of who they were. As Mr. Thomas walked further down the street, he couldn't help but feel a small sense of pride. It wasn't pride in himself, but in the fact that something had changed. Maybe it was small, maybe it was only one step in a longer journey, but it was something, and that mattered. The next day, as he took his usual walk, he noticed the group again. This time they weren't standing together near the car. Instead, they were scattered around the block, talking quietly with different people in the neighborhood. Mr. Thomas noticed the difference immediately. They weren't being loud or disruptive. They were engaging with others, having calm conversations, listening, and showing the kind of respect that he had talked about. One of the young men, the one with the leather jacket, caught Mr. Thomas's eye as he passed by. He gave him a small nod, a quiet gesture of respect. Mr. Thomas smiled faintly and nodded back. He didn't need any more than that. The change, however small, was real. As the days turned into weeks, Mr. Thomas continued his walks and the young men continued to show up. But now they were a little different. They no longer sought trouble. They no longer acted tough or arrogant. Instead, they seemed to have found a quiet understanding. They had learned that strength didn't come from picking on others, from trying to prove something. It came from within. It came from how you treated the people around you, from how you treated yourself. Mr. Thomas could see it in the way they moved through the neighborhood, in the way they interacted with the people around them. There was no longer any sign of the disrespect or defiance that had marked their behavior before. They were, in their own way, changing. One afternoon, as Mr. Thomas was finishing his walk, he spotted the group again. This time they were sitting on a bench at the park, talking quietly among themselves. They weren't the loud, rowdy group they had been when they first crossed paths with Mr. Thomas. They had settled into a more peaceful, respectful way of being. As he walked past them, the young man in the yellow cap who had first approached him stood up. "Hey, Mr. Thomas," he called out, his voice warm. "Thanks again for everything." Mr. Thomas didn't stop, but he did look at him and smile. "No need to thank me," he said softly. "You're the ones doing the hard work. Keep it up." The young man smiled, nodding. "We will. We promise." And with that, Mr. Thomas continued his walk, his cane tapping rhythmically against the sidewalk. He didn't need anything more. He didn't need to hear more apologies or get more thanks. The change had already taken place, not because of him, but because the young men had decided to make it happen. They had decided to take responsibility for their actions and grow from them. As he turned the corner and headed home, Mr. Thomas felt a quiet satisfaction. He had taught them something that they would carry with them for the rest of their lives, and that was enough for him. In the end, it wasn't about the young men thanking him. It was about the fact that they had learned something important, something that would shape the way they lived from now on. Tomorrow, Mr. Thomas would walk again, and perhaps as he walked, the world around him would feel just a little bit kinder. Weeks passed, and life in the neighborhood seemed to settle into a new rhythm. The changes in the group of young men had become more noticeable with each passing day. They weren't the same people who had once made fun of Mr. Thomas. They had become quieter, more thoughtful, and though they still gathered on the corner, they didn't cause the same trouble they had before. Instead of mocking others, they now spoke to people with respect. They had learned something important, something they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. Mr. Thomas has always continued with his daily walks. He didn't look for change in the world around him. He didn't need to. He found peace in the simple things, the steady rhythm of his cane tapping on the sidewalk, the quiet moments spent enjoying the sun and the breeze. He didn't think about the young men too much, but he noticed them from time to time as he passed by. They were always polite now, their heads held a little higher, their smiles a little more sincere. One morning, as Mr. Thomas walked down the street, he saw the group sitting on the same bench in the park. But today was different. They weren't just talking among themselves. They were talking to someone else, an older woman who had lived in the neighborhood for years. Mr. Thomas had seen her many times, but she had always kept to herself. Today, however, she was smiling, chatting with the young men as if they had been friends for years. Mr. Thomas paused for a moment, watching the scene unfold. He could hear their laughter, see the easy way they interacted with the woman. It was a far cry from the group of young men who had once made cruel jokes about others, who had spent their days picking on those they thought weaker or different. Now they were engaging with kindness, showing respect to someone who, like Mr. Thomas, had been quietly part of the neighborhood for years. As he watched, one of the young men, the one with the leather jacket, noticed him standing by. The young man smiled and waved, and Mr. Thomas nodded in return. There was no need for words between them. The change was visible, and that was enough. The days continued to pass, and each one seemed to bring small, quiet moments of growth for the group. They became more involved in the community, helping others when they needed it, offering a hand to those who might have otherwise been ignored. They had learned the true meaning of strength, not the kind that comes from power or fear, but the strength that comes from lifting others up. It was a Saturday afternoon when Mr. Thomas saw them again. This time they were standing near the entrance to the park, talking to a young mother who had just finished her grocery run. Her arms were full, and she seemed to be struggling with the weight of the bags. Without hesitation, one of the young men stepped forward, offering to help. "Here, let me get those for you," he said, his voice gentle. The mother looked at him a little surprised, but smiled in gratitude as he took the bags from her. The other young men followed his lead, helping to carry the groceries and even walking the woman home. Mr. Thomas watched the scene from a distance, his heart warming at the sight. It wasn't just a small gesture. It was a real change in how they saw the world, how they saw others. As he walked past them, one of the young men, this time the one in the yellow cap, caught his eye again. He stepped forward, his face more open than it had ever been before. "Mr. Thomas," he said, his voice full of sincerity, "we just wanted to say thank you. For everything." Mr. Thomas stopped, his cane tapping gently against the ground. "No need for thanks," he replied quietly. "You've already shown it in the way you live now. That's enough." The young man nodded, his eyes reflecting the truth of Mr. Thomas's words. We wanted you to know that we're different now. We're trying to be better, not just for ourselves, but for everyone around us." Mr. Thomas smiled faintly. "That's all anyone can do. Keep trying. Keep learning. Life's about the journey, not the destination." The young man smiled back, a genuine warmth in his eyes. "We will, Mr. Thomas. We'll keep trying." With that, Mr. Thomas continued his walk, his pace slow but steady. The young man didn't follow him this time. Instead, he turned back to his friends and the woman they had just helped. Mr. Thomas couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of pride. He hadn't expected this kind of change, but here it was, unfolding before him in the most beautiful way. The days went on, and Mr. Thomas's routine remained the same. He still walked every day, still took in the simple pleasures of life, the sound of his cane tapping, the feel of the wind against his face. But now when he passed the group of young men, he saw something different. They were no longer the loud, disrespectful group that had once caused trouble. They were quiet, respectful, and engaged in the world around them. They were part of the neighborhood now, and they had earned their place. One evening, as Mr. Thomas was heading home after his walk, he saw the young men again. This time they were standing together, talking quietly among themselves. They didn't see him right away, but when they did, they smiled and waved. Mr. Thomas stopped, feeling the familiar warmth in his heart. He had seen them grow, had witnessed their transformation, and he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of satisfaction. It wasn't just about the changes they had made. It was about the fact that they had made those changes themselves. They had learned, had grown, and had become better people because of it. As he walked toward them, one of the young men stepped forward, his face serious but kind. "Mr. Thomas, we just wanted to thank you again. For everything. For helping us see what really matters." Mr. Thomas smiled and shook his head. "You did the hard work. I just pointed you in the right direction." The young man nodded. "We won't forget this. You've changed our lives." Mr. Thomas nodded back, his heart full. "No, I didn't change your lives. You did that. Just remember what you've learned and keep moving forward." The group stood there, a quiet understanding passing between them. They didn't need any more words. They had already said everything that needed to be said. As Mr. Thomas walked away, he felt a deep sense of peace. He had done what he needed to do. He had shared his wisdom, shown them the importance of respect and kindness, and watched as they took those lessons to heart. Now it was up to them to carry those lessons forward, to continue growing, and to make the world a little bit better, one step at a time. Tomorrow, Mr. Thomas would walk again, and perhaps with each step the world around him would become just a little bit kinder,